We're going to talk about the Asa Restoration Project. All right, so we are in our 9th year of this excavation. First time in history that people of African ancestry have funded and participated in an archaeological excavation. And I want you all to really understand the significance of what we've done, because you won't, to date, we've been doing this for 9 years. The project has been in existence for 11 years. And you all haven't heard about this on the news, have you? We've been making some incredible discoveries over the last 11 years. And people are not publicizing this, but you're hearing about black people killing each other. You're hearing about all the negative stuff, but you're not hearing about the good things that are happening, all right? So I want you all to be aware of the fact that there are good things happening, but those good things oftentimes are not publicized. So we have to be responsible for getting the word out, right? We have to be responsible, thank you. We have to be responsible for letting our community know about what we're doing, so that you can begin to realize that people are still trying to put us in mental slavery, keep us in mental slavery. They're trying to deny us our historical and ancestral birthright. So we have an obligation and a responsibility to study, to have intelligent conversation about what we've studied, and to pass that information on to young folks specifically, right? That's our responsibility. So everybody can see a little bit better now, right? Excellent, okay. So the Asa Restoration Project is dedicated to the memory, to the spirit of this phenomenal brother, Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, who was an educational psychologist. 28 years ago, I wrote my first book, From the Browder File. 28 years ago, very few people outside of Washington, D.C. had ever heard of Anthony Browder, but everyone around the world knew of Asa Hilliard. They knew his reputation as an educator, as a psychologist, as a master teacher, as an African historian, and it was Asa's contribution to my book, which has helped make that book a bestseller for 28 years, and it's still selling. That book, From the Browder File, is one of the most read books in prisons right now. I can't tell you how many letters I get from young men, and unfortunately more young women, who are reading this book now in prison, because for the first time in their lives they're reading. For the first time in their lives they have a structured environment, and they're reading the information in this book, and they're discovering that they're not niggas. They're discovering that they're not bitches and hoes. They're discovering that they are African, and they are descended from the first human beings on the planet, and the people responsible for creating the oldest documented civilization in the history of mankind, and it transforms them. So Asa, Dr. Hilliard, was responsible for opening my eyes to a lot of this information. And we last saw him on August the 7th, 2007, when he did the opening address at a conference that was held in Aswan, Egypt. A week later, he died. So his sudden death came as a shock to everyone who knew him and everyone who loved him. And as I was still mourning his loss a year later, I had the opportunity, when I was in Egypt, to meet a woman, a white woman, a Russian-born, American-trained Egyptologist by the name of Elena Pishtakova, who had discovered these two 25th Dynasty tombs. Now, let me put some things in context. The 25th Dynasty is the 4th golden age of ancient Kemet. The 25th Dynasty is the only dynasty out of the 30 dynasties of Kemet where European Egyptologists will acknowledge that the 25th dynasty was a Negro dynasty. Because the 25th dynasty rulers came from Sudan, came from Kush. And they came into Kush and drove out the Assyrians and reestablished culture and government and architecture and literature in Kemet. They referred to Kemet as the land of their ancestors. They were responsible for restoring 2,000 years of African history. And they represent what another great scholar, Dr. John Henry Clark, referred to as Africa's last great walk in the sun. After the 25th dynasty fell, Africa, Kemet specifically, was no longer in control of her destiny as more foreigners came in and ultimately overran Kemet, renamed it Egypt, and the rest, as we know, is history. So the Asa Restoration Project introduced me to a woman who was excavating these two tombs, a white woman who didn't know anything at all about racism, American racism. She was trained and educated in the United States. And when she found these tombs in 2006, she asked her employer, she worked for a major museum in the United States. She discovered this tomb and she asked them to help fund her work. And they said, no, these are not your people. You shouldn't be interested in this. But because she didn't understand American racism and she knew history, and specifically the history of the 25th dynasty, she said, no, this is very important work. And they refused to fund her work, so she quit her job and used her own money to fund this excavation. So I was introduced to her 2 years into this project by a mutual friend, and she gave me a personal tour of the tomb. They had just found just a small portion of the tomb, and she had run out of money and she was about to give up. But because of my relationship with Dr. Hilliard and Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and Van Sertima and others, I said, no, we're gonna fund this project. And didn't know where I was gonna get the money, but we created the Asa Restoration Project, named it in honor of Asa Hilliard, and I began raising money. So what I want to show you is what the African community, primarily the African American community, has invested their money in over the past 9 years. I want to show you what we have done. So let's begin with, these are some of the scholars who came together in Atlanta, Georgia in 1984 at the Nile Valley Conference. Here's Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Finch, Van Sertima was one of the organizers. He's not in the picture. Here's Naeem Akbar, Hunter Adams, LeGrand Clay, Runoko Rashidi right here. Shows you how old this picture is. And I came to this conference knowing nothing about Kemet, but was amazed by the information that I heard over the course of 3 days. And I said, this is what I want to do. And I began to study and organize myself. And Sheikh Diop came to Atlanta and they gave a number of presentations about the importance of this knowledge. So I'm following in the footsteps of these great scholars who understand how important it is for African people to reclaim African history and culture. So as my colleague Charles Finch, who lives in Atlanta, constantly reminds me, he said, Tony, you're the first black person to fund an archaeological excavation. You're the first black person to excavate in Egypt every year. Nobody else does that. Asa didn't do it. Sheikh Diop didn't do it. Van Sertima didn't do it. Dr. Ben didn't do it. I'm the first one. And I'm doing it because of people who invest in our project and make it possible for us to do what I'm about to share with you now. So this, I've come to understand, is my life's work. I was born to do this work. We are working, yeah, you can clap. It's worth clapping for. This is the primary tomb of Karakhamun. It's in an area on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. Just to give you an orientation, here's the Temple of Hatshepsut. Here's the Valley of the Kings. Here's the Valley of the Queens. So it's in an area that we have renamed the Valley of the Ancestors, because what we have found here is a 25th dynasty necropolis. There were two primary tombs that were there, and then it was only about 5 years ago that we discovered that there's 27 other tombs in that area of other Kushites. Right? So this is Kush in Kemet. So give you orientation. These are the Asasif Mountains, where all of these graves were created, and we are at the foothills of the mountain. The primary person whose tomb we're excavating is a priest by the name of Karakhamun. There's that word again, Amen. His name, Karakhamun. Karakhamun, his name, Ka means spirit, Raket means knows or is known by. Amen is the unseen presence of God Almighty. So his name means the unseen presence of God knows my spirit. He was a priest who worked at this temple complex. This is known as, originally it was known as Ipet-Isut. We know it today as Karnak Temple. Karnak Temple, Ipet-Isut, is the largest temple ever created on the planet. It is larger than the Vatican. You could take every church built in London, put them inside of this temple, and you still have room for 2 football fields. It is huge. This brother was responsible for leading the morning processions down the central axis of this temple to evoke the presence of Amen in the Holy of Holies. 83,000 African men and women worked in this temple complex. And here is Karakhamun's baby brother. His name is Her-Em-Aket, and he was the chief priest at this temple complex. So as we have been excavating at this site, we've been restoring a tomb and also reconstructing a 25th dynasty family. So this tomb was originally built 20 feet underground. In the 1990s, there was a flash flood and water came pouring down the mountain, down into the tomb, and caused the pillars that were holding up the ceiling to collapse, and the entire tomb was swallowed into the earth. And prior to that time, the tomb had been robbed by the Arabs who lived in that area. They stole everything out of the tomb. This tomb is 2,700 years old. The entire tomb is built out of limestone. It was comprised of many rooms, but in 2006, Dr. Linus hired these men. We have about 70 people who are working for us. And they started digging down into the earth, deeper and deeper into the earth, until they began to find traces of pillars that were part of the first pillared hall. Each of these pillars were taller than the ceiling, 10 feet high. The entire tomb was carved out of limestone. So understand this, the creation of this tomb was not architecture, it was sculpture, where you carved out the rock and left behind pillars, you left behind a floor, you left behind a wall, you left behind the ceiling, and every square inch of this tomb was covered with hieroglyphics. Every square inch of it was carved with images of Karakhamun and other personalities, and it was painted. This was an incredible sight. So here are the pillars, the stumps of the pillars. So as we excavate, remember all of this was covered by sand and dirt. So as we excavate and dig down into the earth, we find traces of the pillars, traces of the walls, traces of the ceilings, and each of the pieces that we find, from very small pieces to pieces as large as that table. Every piece that we find has to be numbered, has to be photographed, has to be cataloged, and then cleaned, and then put in storage. Because this project is about excavating and finding the pieces of this tomb, and then restoring it, putting the pieces back together again. So it's like a huge jigsaw puzzle. To date, we have found 27,000 pieces. 27,000 pieces. So to give you some sense of what we've done. Between 2006 and 2010, we excavated in the first pillared hall, the first room of the tomb. 2010, 2011, we excavated in the second pillared hall, the second room of the tomb. 2012, we excavated the open air sun court, the atrium, the entrance to the tomb. This area was open to the sky. All of this was covered and underground. Okay? And then in 2013, we excavated the original stairs leading to the tomb. So beginning in 2013, we were now able to enter the tomb of Karakhamun through the original staircase for the first time in over 1,000 years. Right? So this is what we have done. So just to give you, yeah, you can clap if you want to. So just to give you a sense of what we have excavated, we have completed the excavation of this tomb, and now we are rebuilding it. We are restoring it. So just to give you a sense of the size of Karakhamun's tomb. Everyone has heard of King Tut, right? The young king, the young boy king of the 18th dynasty, right? So to give you a sense of size, here's a floor plan of Karakhamun's tomb, the first pillared hall and the second pillared hall. Karakhamun's tomb is 4 times larger than King Tut's tomb. Karakhamun's tomb contains texts all along the walls, along the pillars. In both rooms there is text. There is text from the book of the hours, the 12 hours of the day and the 12 hours of the night. There's chapters, 75 chapters from the book of coming forth by day, the so-called book of the dead. And we also have at least 20 replicated passages from the book of coming forth by day. And we have pyramid texts. I'll get to the pyramid text from the pyramid of Unas that was built in the 6th dynasty. This is 25th dynasty. All right, so this is phenomenal what these Kushites did 2,000 years later. They went back and restored the legacy of their ancestors, and Karakhamun had all of this knowledge incorporated into his tomb. So it is a treasure. Even though the tomb was robbed and all of the contents of his burial chamber, the gold and the mummy and all of those things were stolen, God knows when. But what's left behind, the treasures on the walls, the paintings, the carvings, the texts, is a miracle in and of itself. Really phenomenal information. So give you a sense of time frame, Karakhamun's tomb was built approximately 750 years after Moses, 750 years before Jesus. This is what African people who look just like us did. This was around the time that Rome was created. Karakhamun's tomb was built. So, in 2010, we dug out this staircase which led to the burial compartment. So the tomb is 20 feet underground, and then we dug out these steps which took us another 10 feet underground. And in that burial compartment, we found a small room, and in the corner of that small room was a shaft, 5 feet by 6 feet wide. And that shaft descended into the earth another 30 feet. So 2010, August in 2010, we had brought a group on a study tour to Egypt to visit the site. And my daughter also came back to work at the site. And so here's a photograph of my daughter descending the ladder to go to the burial chamber of this priest. At that time, we didn't have a lot of money to buy the equipment that we needed to do the work. So at that time in 2010, we didn't have a 30-foot ladder. So we did the next best thing. We tied 2 15-foot ladders together. All right? So here's the 2 ladders tied together. And my daughter is now climbing down the ladder. And as the both of us stood at the bottom of this shaft, 70 feet underground, as we both stood at the entrance to the burial chamber, the 2,700-year-old burial chamber of this priest Karakhamun, I told my daughter that I wanted her to go in first, so that history would record that my daughter, Eyedontha Sntayehu, was the first African American inside of the tomb of Karakhamun. All right? So for the rest of all time, every history book about that tomb will record my daughter was the first African American to go inside of that tomb. That's how you make history. You do it. You don't ask anybody's permission. You do the work. You do the work. So do you all want to see what we found? You sure? Yes. Well, let me take a sip of ginger beer. I'm thirsty. This is good ginger beer. Can you bring me another one of these? This is good. 70 feet underground. My daughter and I, alone, just the two of us, worked in this burial chamber for 6 days. Just the two of us. Now we're sitting on top of debris that the tomb robbers filled up this tomb with. So we're sitting on top of the debris. My head is almost touching the ceiling. So the floor to ceiling height is about as high as this ceiling. And I'm sitting on debris up to about right here. So the two of us were in that space, excavating, finding some incredible things. And having a very serious daddy-daughter conversation. You know, talking about how is it that the two of us are here in this space. The two of us. You know, I never would have imagined that I would be excavating in Egypt, that I would be financing an excavation, and that I would be there with my daughter doing this work. All right? So it helped us really ground ourselves in our history, our culture, and to also model for other fathers the quality of relationships that they should have with their children. All right? So I've been taking my daughter to Egypt with me since she was 7 years old. When my daughter was 8 years old, we published her first book, My First Trip to Africa, which was about, thank you, sir, which was about her trip to Egypt. My daughter, since she was 8 years old, has been traveling around the country and around the world lecturing about her experiences in Africa. My daughter, since she was 8 years old, has been making $200 an hour to come to speak at churches and schools and other organizations. So we made this a business. And I made a deal with my daughter that wherever we travel to Africa together, bless you, sir, we'll write books about our experiences so that other children who look like you can read about their history from somebody who looks like them. So when she was 10, we went to Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, and the Ivory Coast. We visited the slave dungeons where the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the British built all of these slave dungeons to house our ancestors before they put them on those slave ships and dragged them across the ocean and enslaved them in Suriname, in Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, in New York, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Brazil. That's how we got there. So I wanted my daughter to see these slave dungeons for herself. I took the responsibility to teach my daughter her history. I'm not going to allow teachers to lie to her. And then we go to Africa. So she published her second book when she was 12, and by the time she went to college, she had written more books than her professors. It's true. By the time she went to college, her history professor was using my book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, to teach African history. So she began to see, she began to understand, and what was interesting, you know, growing up, she thought everybody's father took them to Africa. She thought everybody's father wrote books with their daughters. But after she got to college and realized that she lived a unique life. So my daughter comes to Egypt with me every summer. She's an educator. She comes to Egypt with me every summer. She works at the site. She's working on 2 books right now. So you'll be hearing from us. And maybe my daughter and I are going to be coming to England in May for a conference. So maybe, just maybe, if you all want us back, we might come here. The 2 of us might come here, right? So what I'm saying, if you want that to happen, y'all got to make it happen, right? You got to support the House of Khepera, right? You got to spread the word and bring somebody with you to our next presentation so that we have a space twice this large and we can share this history with everybody else who needs to know, all right? So that's how this works. Everybody's got a job to do. Everybody can do something. And if we all do a little bit, then we all can rise together, right? So let me show you the restoration portion of the Asa Restoration Project. This is the vestibule which separates the first pillared hall from the second pillared hall. This photograph was taken in 2010 when we started excavating in the second pillared hall. So here's the entrance to the second pillared hall. This photograph was taken in 2010. This is a photograph taken in 2012. So what we do is we rebuild the walls. We rebuild the pillars. We have a stone cutting machine. Had a brother from Texas, Houston, Texas, who came on our study tour 3 years ago. And our workers were literally cutting the stone by hand, like Fred Flintstone, right? And he said, my God, there has to be a better way to do this. We said, well, there is, if we had a stone cutting machine. He wrote us a check on the spot for a stone cutting machine. We have the only stone cutting machine in Upper Egypt. So with that one piece of equipment, we're now able to cut our workload by 2/3. And we can now cut these blocks of stone and bring them in to rebuild the pillars and the walls. So this photograph was taken in 2014. And then this photograph was taken last summer. Okay? This is the Asa Restoration Project. We are restoring this tomb. And as we restore the tomb, we take the fragments and insert them into the walls and the pillars. So this is very tedious work, very time-consuming work, and we work during the summer. We work from May until August. And the average temperature is about 118 degrees. It's hot, but it's good work. It's good work. The room here at the end of the tomb is my favorite part of the tomb. This is the western wall of the tomb. This is the image that's on the poster advertising this lecture. And here in the central aisle of the tomb is a niche, and inside of the niche is a statue of Asar. Asar is the Lord of resurrection. So the whole purpose of this tomb was to have words written on the walls, words written on the pillars, so that as the spirit of Karakhamun walked through the tomb, walking towards Asar, he would know the words to say to prepare his soul to greet Asar so that he could be resurrected from the dead. All right? This is 700 years before the birth of Jesus. This is in Africa right now. Okay? So give you an overview of the process. Here is a photograph taken in 2010 when we excavated the second pillared hall. All of this was covered with debris. And then this is how we rebuild it. We add blocks of stone. We buy steel beams to reinforce the stone to secure it. And then we put the pieces back together again. Here's the steps leading down to the burial chamber. And then these pictures were taken last July of 2016, when we were finishing up the second pillared hall. We fully restored the second pillared hall last fall, and then on September the 24th, we held a formal opening of the second pillared hall. We had the Minister of Antiquities, the Governor of Luxor, other high Egyptian officials came to see what we had done. And everybody marveled at the quality of the work. They said that nobody in Egypt is rebuilding a tomb like we have rebuilt this tomb. Right? So we're making a space in history right now. So these are our workers. Rebuilding all of this, all the white stone is new stone, right? So you can see all the rebuilding that we've done. So here is 3 shots. This shows you July of last year in that same room, and here's a photograph taken 2 months later. This is the same room. And this is that same room looking in the opposite direction. This is the Asa Restoration Project. This is what we are doing, the first black people in history, right? So don't let anybody tell you that we're not busy. We're not using our money and our time constructively. I'm showing you the evidence. So here is an aerial shot that a colleague of mine took in a balloon over the site. Here is Karakhamun's tomb. Here's the staircase, the atrium, first pillared hall, the second pillared hall. And then here is the tomb of another brother, a man by the name of Karabashkin, whose tomb had not been destroyed. It was a very small tomb. It was unfinished. and because his tomb was unfinished, what that means is Karabashkin died before his tomb was completed. So upon his death, then they have 70 days to prepare the body for burial. 70 days. Why 70 days? 70 days is the time frame it took Aset to find the missing pieces of Asar's body and to prepare his body for burial. So everybody who's been mummified in Egypt follows the same period, time frame that Aset used thousands of years earlier. So we see here historical continuity. All of this was before slavery, when we knew who we were, when we documented our history, and we left a record that is there right now, that we're uncovering and presenting to you right now so that we can begin to see ourselves as African people and be proud of what our ancestors have accomplished. So this is Karabashkin. Karabashkin was the mayor of Waset. Waset is the original name, the Kemetic name for the city that the Greeks called Thebes and the Arabs called Luxor. So he was the mayor of Luxor. And Luxor, or Waset, was from the 18th dynasty on, Waset was the capital of Kemet. It was the political and the spiritual capital of Kemet. So this was the power center. This is the only statue, one of several small statues of him that we found. This brother from Kush was the mayor, was the governor. He ran this city. So we see here another wonderful example of African leadership. He was part of a team of other Africans responsible for making this happen. And there were two major temples in this town. One is the temple of Luxor, the other is Karnak temple, or Apet. He was responsible for rebuilding these temples and maintaining the religious ceremonies that took place twice a year at this site. Last July, we found the burial chamber of Karabashkin. We finally dug it up and found the burial chamber of Karabashkin. And in his burial chamber, we found his sarcophagus. Now here's a photograph. This is my project manager, Darren McKnight, who is a major part of our team. This is my cousin, Dietrich, who is an engineer, so he's the engineer on site. So we've got professionals. We've got very highly skilled people assisting us in restoring this tomb. We are here doing this work, okay? So here's a close-up shot of his sarcophagus. Another member of our team, we're measuring it. So this structure measures 8 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 12 feet long. It weighs 10 tons, 20,000 pounds. 20,000 pounds. And the sarcophagus, you can't really tell from this picture, but this sarcophagus is made out of rose granite. Rose granite was a special stone that was only used for royalty. And it was quarried in Aswan, which is 100 miles to the south. So these Africans, these Kushites, cut this stone in Aswan, transported it 100 miles north, cut this sarcophagus into 2 pieces, and then brought it down inside of his tomb. I don't know how the hell they did it, but we got the evidence that they did. It's still there. It's still there. So this made big news in Egypt last summer. And again, so the Egyptians are beginning to see us as major players now. We're not just coming to Egypt as tourists. We now are financing excavations. We're now finding some incredible things. We're uncovering and adding to the history of the oldest civilization on the planet. So they're seeing black people now through a different eyes. They've never had black people do this before. So I'm having regular meetings with the governor of Luxor. We're talking about opening up doorways for people of African ancestry to come to Egypt and do some other things. We're making some deals now, believe me. We're making some deals. So just to share with you, this is Karabashkin's tomb when it was first discovered in 2006. As I said, it was never completed because he died, so there's no carvings on the walls, right? And we used his tomb as storage because it was empty. So that of the 27,000 pieces that we found in Karakhamun's tomb, we wanted to put them in a safe place. So this was our storage facility. So here is Karabaskin's tomb, a photograph from 2006. Let me show you what it looks like now as a result of our excavation. Bam! This is the Asa Restoration Project, okay? So, last fall, September the 24th and 25th, we had, 25th and 26th, we had a conference right after we opened the second pillared hall and had everyone see our work. And then we had a 2-day conference where we brought together other scholars, other archaeologists who are specializing in 25th dynasty work. And we showcased our work, and then we shared information with our colleagues of what we discovered, right? So it's an information exchange, the second such event that transpired in Luxor since we've been there, right? So I'm addressing the people at the conference and basically making them aware of something that they already were aware of, but I wanted to reinforce that fact that the excavation and restoration that they just witnessed the day before was funded by African American dollars. And that we have made it possible for other Egyptologists and other scholars to come and get their masters and PhDs working at the site that we were funding. And so we are building relationships with other Europeans. I mean, all the folk who are there are Europeans, you know, from England, from America, and elsewhere. So we're cultivating relationships with them, and they're, for the first time in their lives, they're meeting black folk. They never met black folk before. The only black folk they know are black folk they see on the music videos, or movies. So they're now realizing that black folk know how to speak. Black folk know how to think. We're not all gangsters and thugs. So we're changing their perceptions of us by our presence. So I share with the audience that the significance of what we had accomplished did not escape me the day before, on September the 24th, when we opened the second pillared hall. At the exact moment that we opened the second pillared hall on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt, President Barack Obama was 6,100 miles away in Washington, D.C., opening up the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the exact same moment. Okay? So, what I want to share with you now is some new information. I haven't even written this up yet, so I'm working on a couple of new books. But last September, during this trip to Egypt, September last year, matter of fact, on September the 28th, I saw something that blew my mind. I made a discovery that has changed everything. I'm going to show you, but let me have another drink of this delicious beverage. It's so good. So, I'm going to connect some dots for you and show you how all of this is happening exactly the way the Creator wanted it to happen. All right? I want you all to see this. I want you to get this. So, in this museum, let me back up for a minute. The National Museum of African American History and Culture cost $560 million to build. All right? It took 13 years to construct this building. It was designed by a Ghanaian architect who lives in London. And his inspiration for the upper part of this museum is a sculpture within a Yoruba shrine. Right? So, but anyway, inside of this museum it has over 30,000 artifacts. And it details the history of African Americans, right? Unfortunately, the only negative thing that I have to say about this museum is that it's called the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it begins our story in slavery. Now, y'all know how I feel about that. In this museum, they say nothing about who Africans were before Europeans came in and destroyed our way of life. You have to go to some other museums to find that, but I'm working on another book that's going to lay out that story so that those who are interested will have both pieces of the puzzle. And they can understand what's not in that museum, so that when they go into that museum, they can go in with a greater sense of consciousness. And they can connect the dots and know our full story. But inside of this museum, one of the things that they talk about during the process of enslavement is that many African Americans were stolen from Ghana. And they make reference to the Adinkra symbols, which are used in Ghana. And the Adinkra symbols were used primarily to memorialize and honor the dead. Adinkra symbols. So there are a number of significant Adinkra symbols that are a part of the experience of Africans reclaiming their history and culture. One specific symbol is this symbol here. Any of you all know this? Sankofa. Sankofa. Sankofa is an Akan word from Ghana, West Africa, that means to go back and fetch your knowledge, to go back and fetch your history. What you see here is a bird which is standing on top of a pyramid. Think this, bird standing on top of a pyramid. Its feet are facing forward, which represents the present moment. Its head is turned back. And typically, so the head turning back means it's turning back to the past. And typically, the bird will have in its mouth an egg, which represents the future, or their children. So this idea of Sankofa means to go back and capture the knowledge of the past and pass it on to your children so that they will know who they are. That's Sankofa. So there was a book in that museum. It was one of the first books on African studies, and the entire book is covered with Adinkra symbols. There is one particular Adinkra symbol that caught my eye. This is another Ghanaian symbol that represents Sankofa, the same process of going back to reclaim your past, the knowledge of the past. These symbols are about 300 years old. Okay? So you all got that? Okay. So here's another expression of the Adinkra symbol of Sankofa. And here is, this is a gown of Janetta Cole. She was the president of Spelman College, and she's wearing a graduation gown which has a Sankofa symbol. So it's a very popular symbol among the African American community, because we are striving to reclaim our historical memory, and we fixate on Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria are where many Africans were brought in America. Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. So we have a great affinity for this culture and the symbols associated with that culture. So let me share this with you. This is an area near the Temple of Hatshepsut, about 2 miles from where we're excavating. On September the 28th, as part of our conference, we did a site visit to some other tombs, some other 25th Dynasty tombs that some other Egyptologists were working on. And I went into one specific 25th Dynasty tomb that a team from France are working on. Another priest, another 25th Dynasty priest. And when I walked inside of this tomb, my first time inside of that tomb, and as those who know me know, whenever I go anyplace, I'm always looking around. I'm always checking out my environment. I'm always taking in everything that's around me, right? Because I know everything has a meaning. And by looking and learning to be observant, you now find information that's waiting for you. So when I walked into this tomb, right down here, there's a door right here of this tomb, and looked up at the ceiling of the tomb, guess what I found?
Dang, dang.
Wow.
Y'all see that? Yeah. The Sankofa symbol painted on the ceiling of a 25th Dynasty tomb 2,400 years before they made its way in Ghana in West Africa, 2,000 miles away. So what does that mean? It's opened up a whole new area of research. What does that mean? What it means is this. What it means, and so it's not a coincidence. This is a Sankofa symbol from Ghana. So the Ghanaians have been saying for years that their ancestors came from Kemet. The Ghanaians have been saying for years that the kingship rituals that the Ashanti and others use, the Akan use, those kingship patterns came from the Nile Valley, came from Kemet. So I've heard this, but I thought it was just an old wives' tale, something that they were saying to make themselves feel good. Now I've got some evidence to back that up. And as I do more research, what I now know is this. What I now know is this. In Kemet, around the time of the 25th dynasty, those priests and priestesses knew that Kemet was going to fall. They knew that the Persians were going to come in. They knew that the Romans and the Greeks were going to come in. They knew that the Arabs were going to come in. They knew that the Europeans, the British and the French and others were going to come in. They knew because they had foresight. They knew that the knowledge that their ancestors had created was too important, too valuable to allow to fall into the hands of these barbarians. So what they did was they packed up some of that knowledge and sent it from East Africa into West Africa, from the Nile to the Niger. There's a book entitled Paths from the Nile, written by a colleague of Sheikh Anta. His name is Abubakar Lam. Lam, Paths from the Nile. And in that book, he documents the migration of African knowledge, scientific knowledge, spiritual knowledge, engineering knowledge, astronomical knowledge being sent now in 6 different migrations. One piece of the information went to Ghana, another piece of the information went to Senegal, another piece of information went to Nigeria, another piece went to Togo and Benin, and then the last piece went to Mali and influenced the Dogon. And you all know about the Dogon. Their cosmology is straight out of the Nile Valley. So we now have evidence proving that the Africans in the Nile Valley moved some of their information to the Niger River Valley. So process this for a minute. I want us to think like our Nile Valley ancestors who knew that the end was coming. And they said, we've got 3,000 years of history that we can't allow to fall into the hands of these barbarians. We have to keep it safe. So they sent it to West Africa, and it jump-started the Akan traditions, the Yoruba traditions, the Wolof traditions, the Dogon traditions. So follow this line of reasoning now. If these African men and women had enough foresight to know that the Nile Valley was going to fall, and they sent this information further west, then they had to have known that West Africa was going to fall. And those Africans with that knowledge were going to be brought to the Americas as part of this European enslavement of African people. Million African men, women, and children were stolen from their homeland, with all of the knowledge that had been passed on to them by their ancestors from the Nile Valley. So now they've been brought to the New World. They've been brought to Suriname, to Belize, to Cuba, to Haiti, to Jamaica, to the United States, to Mexico, all right? So now, process this. Hold on one second, we're gonna do a Q&A. Hold on. Process this. They needed to make sure that the knowledge and information was safe, to keep it out of the hands of the Europeans. We went from here to here, and then from here to here, right? Which means now that Africans from West Africa are genetically linked to Africans from East Africa. Africans who were brought to the New World, to Suriname, to the United States, to Jamaica, are the descendants of Africans from West Africa who are the descendants of Africans from East Africa, which means that we carry in our DNA the ancestral memories of these people who lived in the Nile River Valley. So that knowledge is preserved in our minds, in our consciousness. So when we free our minds, we are now able to begin to access that information. And that is what's happening right now. All right? That's what's happening right now. So speaking from personal experiences, as America is going to hell, America is going to hell right now. You all see that. America has the worst president in the history of the United States of America. He is a laughingstock of the world. And he has ushered in a new era of racism. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if within the next 2 or 3 years there's another civil war in the United States. The ground has already been set for that to happen. Don't be surprised when it does. Trump has upped the ante of racist attacks against black folk, black children. So things are going to get bad. But they've got to get bad before they get better, huh? And they are going to get better. So let me just show you what's happening as proof that it's going to get better. This is what I know. So we've gone from Sankofa symbols in the Nile River Valley, Sankofa symbols in the Niger River Valley, and now Sankofa symbols in the United States of America, in North America. So this building is a year old, right? This museum is the hottest ticket in the United States. You have to wait for hours just to get inside of this building. The lines are so long. This is the second most visited museum in the world, second only to the Louvre. People are coming from all across the United States. People are coming from all over the world to see this museum. All right. So let me break some things down for you about this museum. At the entrance to the museum is this oculus. An oculus is an architectural structure that symbolizes the eye of God. Many temples in the ancient world have a hole in the center of the temple to allow light from the sun. The sun is a symbol of God, to allow the eye of God and the presence of God inside of the temple. So this Ghanaian architect who designed this building, designed this oculus at the entrance to the building. Why? Because this site at 15th and Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. was the site of an auction block where Africans were sold right across the street from the Washington Monument. There's over a dozen auction blocks in Washington, D.C., but there are no monuments, no placards whatsoever to denote what Europeans did to our ancestors. So we have to now document that history. So I'm so proud of the fact that this brother from Ghana who lives in London did his homework and put something there to wake all of us up. So this oculus is above the room that people are encouraged to go into after they visit the lower levels of the museum, which depict the history of our enslavement. I mean, it's very graphic in terms of talking about what happened to our ancestors, how American slave wealth helped to build America and make it the financial capital of the world. It's all built on the back of my ancestors, our ancestors, all right? And so we're invited to go into this room that's directly underneath the oculus. Here is the opening of the oculus above. And so sunlight comes into this room, and then water pours down. So it's almost as if the tears from God are crying when we consider what happened to his children, us. And we're invited to come into this room, rest, reflect, and recharge. Rest and reflect on what we've seen and how we've survived the worst conditions that any people on this planet have gone through, and we're still here. We still have our minds, some of us still have our minds intact. Right? And we come to this place to remember and then to honor our ancestors. So it's like this room is a room where libations are being poured continuously. And so we go into that space, and I'm asking everybody who goes into that space to remember and to resurrect the memory of your ancestors and to restore what they have done, to restore their legacy. That's why we are here. It's no accident. So once we know who we are, it changes everything. So this t-shirt reflects what we're going to be working on for our 10-year celebration of the Asa Restoration Project. And it speaks to what is now here in D.C. to remind us so that we can remind everybody else in the world. Now, I mentioned to you that the upper portion of this museum was inspired by the crown from a Yoruba shrine. And the shrines were built for the ancestors, a sacred space for the ancestors to come. Just as Karakhamun's tomb is a temple tomb, it's a shrine for people to come and pay homage to Karakhamun and the other Kushite and Kemetic ancestors. That's what it was used for. So this Ghanaian architect built the top part of this temple like a shrine, and he also made sure that the angle of this shrine was the same angle, 17 degrees, as the top of the Tekken or the Washington Monument. Right? So look, he's making a connection between the Niger River Valley and the Nile River Valley. It's happening. And white folk can't stop this. It's happening. The other thing that I want you all to understand is that, let me go back a couple of slides so you all can see this better. This building. So essentially the top portion of this shrine, and he mentions that this museum is more than a museum, it's actually a shrine. Because inside of this museum are artifacts from our ancestors dating back at least 400 years. So all of those artifacts, the chains, the clothes that they wore, Nat Turner's Bible is in there. The shawl that Harriet Tubman wore is in there. There's a slave cabin in there. So there's many artifacts. They've got Michael Jackson's hat. They've got Earth, Wind, and Fire's hat. So all of this stuff in here of people who are now ancestors. So this is a sacred space. And if you understand anything about African spiritual traditions, whatever you wore, whatever you use, the energy from your body is in those things. So we've got over 30,000 artifacts with the energy of 30,000 African ancestors in this sacred space. So when you come into this space with the right consciousness, you now can access those ancestors and they can work through you. So America, as America is going to hell, we got our rescue right here. We've got access to all of these ancestors right there. So let me explain to you symbolically what this building represents. So you all know what this is, right? This is a Tekken. This is a symbol that represents the resurrection of a Tsar, the first person in the history of mankind who died and was resurrected, an African king. This is the symbol which represents the capital of the United States of America. And directly across the street from that building, from this monument, is a new building, and the top part of this building looks like 3 inverted pyramids. Huh? You all see that? And where do you find 3 pyramids? At Giza. An inverted pyramid, a V, an inverted pyramid represents the feminine spirit. It symbolizes the womb, which looks like a V. A Tekken, someone asked me during the break, I told the story about a Tsar, and the Tsar's body was cut into 14 pieces, and the set only found 13 of the 14 parts of a Tsar's body. What was that last part? I looked at the sister, you know what that last part was. And you all laughing because you know what it was too. The last part was his penis, which is a phallic symbol, which is a symbol of resurrection. Y'all brothers know what I'm talking about, don't you? Right? So the Tekken not only represents the resurrection of a Tsar, but it also represents the phallus of an African king. So follow this. Understand this. At the corner of 15th Street and Constitution Avenue, we have a feminine symbol of African procreation and a masculine symbol of African procreation right at that location, which then symbolically, metaphorically, speaks to the fact that right there we have the capacity to now give birth to a new consciousness of African people, a new nation of African people. So that knowledge is in us. And when we know that, when we know that, and when we can be conscientious about accessing that knowledge, we now have access to 200,000 years of African greatness, which means that we now can do anything that our ancestors have done. White folk are not going to tell you all this. They're not going to teach you this. Because if they did, it's over. I mean, it's over. They know that. So the things that we're doing, the things that the House of Khepera is doing, is bringing you information that allows you now to transform your consciousness so that you can be a part of other African people who are in the process of transforming the world. It's our time now. So we have to rise with the new spirit, with the new understanding of who we are and what it is that we can do. So I'm going to wind up, I'm going to close by letting you know you're going to hear more about this project. You're going to hear more about some of the other things that we've discovered and what all of these discoveries mean and the role that you can play if you choose to. It's a choice, if you choose to. I know that this ain't for everybody, because there's a lot of folk who don't want to read, who don't want to study, who don't want to give up Jesus, who don't want to give up Allah, you know, who are comfortable where you are. And if that's your choice, that's your choice. That's all right. But just be aware of the fact that the new world is coming. And new things are about to happen. And if you choose to be a part of this new world, if you choose to be an active participant, then there is an assignment for you. There's a role that you can play. So I want to wind down by telling you all that we don't just talk about history, we make history. Dig it? You know, we literally digging it up, right? That's how you do it. And the most important message that I can leave you all with is very simple. We are the vessels through which our ancestors breathe, speak, and do their best work. We are the vessels. That's why we are still here. That's why we survived. So we're here for a purpose. Every African life has value. And when you value yourself and value your ancestors, read and study, apply the knowledge that you've read into your life, you will see miracles occurring in your life. It's a miracle that I'm doing this archaeological work in Egypt. I'm not a trained archaeologist. I'm not a trained Egyptologist, but I know more about Egypt than the average person who's got a degree in Egyptology. So obviously there's another force that is working through me to make all of these things happen. And I'm aware of that, and I'm willing to be an active participant in that because I am building for the next 150 years. I'm dedicating my time to preparing the next generations so that they will know who they are and they will help to create this new world that we're bringing into existence.